Welcome to this online lecture for U.S. History 1. Today we're going to be talking about one of the more tragic events in U.S. history, and that is the removal of the Cherokee and other tribes from the Eastern Territories to what is now Oklahoma. As always, there are some terms that you should be able to track by the time this lecture is over, as well as some questions you should be able to answer as well. So let's get to it. Earlier this football season, Oklahoma State football fans were criticized for holding this banner before their game with the Florida State Seminoles. Why? Well, what's wrong with it? Well, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that what they're saying is send them home at the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is, of course, as I said, not a proud moment in the history of the United States, and in fact, one of the more tragic and unjust moments. And so we're going to try to understand exactly what the Trail of Tears was and how it occurred. But before we get to that, we need to understand, or at least review, U.S. Indian policy up until Indian removal. But before we can talk about the Trail of Tears, we need to first understand what U.S. Indian policy was like before the 1830s. Really, there were two components to this policy. There was the treaty, and then there was conquest. We've seen how the U.S. government sought to first convince tribal leaders to sign legally binding treaties giving up their rights to their lands. When tribes would refuse to do this, then the government sent in the army. And we've seen this actually sometimes they went hand in hand. For example, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket refused to sign a treaty with the U.S. government, and so the U.S. government sent in the army and ultimately defeated the Indians in battle, and thereby forced them to sign the Treaty of Greenville. Okay, so that's really been how things have been going. But there really is a third policy that we need to talk about, and that is a policy called civilization. Some Americans argue that the future of Native Americans depended on their ability to become civilized. In other words, they needed to learn to live like white people. That meant becoming farmers, building permanent homes and towns, establishing laws, etc. One such proponent was our third president, Thomas Jefferson, who argued that if Indians could be convinced to take up farming, then, quote, they will perceive how useless to them are their extensive forests, and will be willing to pare them off from time to time in exchange for necessaries for their farms and families, end quote. In other words, if we can convince Indians to become civilized like white people, to become farmers, they won't need all of those forests. They won't need all of that land, and that will free up land for white settlement. Actually, however, Jefferson's also arguing that really civilization is in the Indians' best interests because ultimately Indians would be surrounded by white settlement, and that would force them to make a choice. They had to choose between becoming civilized or being destroyed. And just to repeat, their choice was between civilization, destruction, or a third choice was removal to lands across the Mississippi River. This was made possible with the Louisiana Purchase in 1804. If we could simply get the Indians across the Mississippi River, they could live in their traditional way. That was the argument anyway. They could continue to live their traditional lives, and white folks could take up their lands out east and settle them. So you can understand one reason why Jefferson saw the Louisiana Purchase as a great thing. It's going to make it possible to remove Indians to a place where they're out of the way. So this is also a policy that's going to become known as Indian removal. Specifically, all of Oklahoma and large chunks of Kansas would be reserved for native peoples unwilling to civilize. Now, before 1830, most of the tribes removed and resettled west of the Mississippi River were those tribes in the northeast portion of the country. Many of these tribes would be those who had fought with Little Turtle, with Blue Jacket, with Tecumseh. For example, we had the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox, the Ottawa, the Wyandot, the Iowa, but there were really many, many, many others. Tribes in the American Southeast, on the other hand, resisted removal. Instead, they worked to accommodate American demands by abandoning many of their ways and becoming, quote unquote, civilized. We are going to focus on the Cherokee because their story is probably the one most people know best. However, there were four other tribes known as the civilized tribes. The five civilized tribes were the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. But as I said, we're going to talk about the Cherokee because they are perhaps the best example of this. The Cherokee homeland was in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, before white folks came along, the Cherokee had been a semi-sedentary culture. That meant they did practice some farming. They did build semi-permanent villages. However, they would move those villages from time to time when the needs of hunting or agriculture demanded. So in other words, if they wore out the land, they would simply move their village to a new field. They did not live in permanent cities. They did not live in permanent settlements, but neither were they completely nomadic. Now, initially, the Cherokee had sided with the British in trying to fight American settlement. But really, setbacks during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, in other words, their side always seemed to lose, convinced them that they could not survive if they continued to resist American expansion. Moreover, their lands were being whittled away until they held just the northwest corner of Georgia. Essentially, the idea was if you can't beat them, join them. That sort of became their motto. And the Cherokee began to work to transform their culture in accordance with U.S. demands. But what did that mean? Well, the Cherokee decided that civilization meant several things. First of all, they said to be a civilized people, you need to have a written language. And in 1821, an incredibly brilliant Cherokee man by the name of Sequoyah developed a Cherokee written language. In other words, he took the Cherokee language and he created symbols, an alphabet, that would allow them to write words down. The Cherokee also decided that a civilized people had newspapers. And so, now that they have a written language, in 1828 they began publishing a written newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. They also decided that civilized people have written laws. And so, therefore, they wrote a constitution. They began writing down their laws. In their constitution, the Cherokee created a government that was modeled on the American government. For example, they had a two-house legislature, just like we had a House of Representatives and a Senate. They did too. They had a president and a vice president, though they called them principal chief and second chief. They even had a court system modeled on our Supreme Court. But there were other things as well. For one thing, they developed a school system. And because the quote unquote civilized white people around them practiced African American slavery, they also legalized slavery. They began buying and selling slaves within Cherokee territory. By the late 1820s, the Cherokee believe they have done everything they can to stave off American expansion. They even have guaranteed title to their lands through legally written treaties. And again, that's U.S. policy to create treaties with peoples that will tell the Indians what is their land and what lands are not theirs. Well, they have those treaties that guarantee them access to what they call the Cherokee homeland. In other words, they have become civilized. Now, by the late 1820s, the Cherokee territory is almost entirely contained within the state of Georgia. White folks were largely content to allow the Cherokee to live on their own. That is until 1827 when gold was discovered in the Cherokee territory. This led to a flood of white prospectors into Cherokee lands. Moreover, now that they knew the lands were worth something, the state of Georgia claimed authority over Cherokee lands. Now, Georgia even claimed that it could force the Cherokee off of their lands without a treaty because this is our land. Georgia says this is our territory, this is our land. And so therefore the Cherokee have no right to this land. We can get rid of them without a treaty if we like. Now, the Cherokee obviously disagreed, and this led to a legal crisis. This legal crisis ultimately ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, the Cherokee are the first Indian tribe to have a case brought before the Supreme Court. The case revolved around, well, who had authority over Indian lands? Indians? The federal government? The states? Now, Chief Justice John Marshall, in two cases, Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia, basically came down on the side of the Cherokee both times. The ruling was that Georgia had no right to execute its laws within an Indian nation. The U.S. government had a treaty with the Cherokee that protected them from state interference, and that treaty had the force of law. So the Cherokee have won. Everything's great, right? No. The state of Georgia basically decides it's going to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling. Worcester, the fellow at the center of the one case, who has been jailed by Georgia, will remain in jail until 1833, even though the Supreme Court ordered his release. Now, the U.S. government could have sent in troops to force white people off of the Cherokee lands. The U.S. government could have simply said the Supreme Court has ruled and we must abide by that decision. The U.S. government refused to do that. The U.S. government sided with the state of Georgia, even though its own laws, even though its own Supreme Court has declared that the Cherokee are the ones who are in charge in this land. This creates a crisis within the Cherokee Nation because what are they going to do next? Some Cherokee argued that really they can't fight the U.S. government, they can't resist the state of Georgia. And so in 1835, they pass the Treaty of New Eshata. This gave up all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi River for $5 million. It also granted the Cherokee 7 million acres in the territory of Oklahoma, west of the Mississippi River. There's only one problem with the Treaty of New Eshata. It is not approved by the Cherokee government. In fact, the Cherokee government opposes this treaty. And so basically this treaty is completely illegal. The U.S. government has signed a treaty with a group of Cherokee who have no right to give up their lands. They have no authority to sign this treaty. It's a completely illegal treaty. John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokee, put it this way: whereas the title of the Cherokee people to their lands is the most ancient, pure, and absolute known to man, its date is beyond the reach of human records, its validity confirmed and illustrated by possession and enjoyment, antecedent to all pretense of claim by any other portion of the human race. End quote. It didn't matter. In 1838, the U.S. government sent in the army and forced the Cherokee off of their lands. 15,000 Cherokee were forced to leave Georgia and walk to Oklahoma. The trip, known as the Trail of Tears, was brutal. As I said, they walked to Oklahoma. The weather was bitter. The ice flows on the Mississippi River were dangerous. There was constant sickness in the Cherokee camp, and 1,500 died before they even left for Oklahoma. About another 1,600 died along the way.